Hi, welcome to Culture and Causation. I'm Aaron Briley, and my guest today is Nila Bala, Associate Director, Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties at R Street. R Street Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research organization whose mission is to engage in policy research and outreach to promote free markets and limited effective government. Nila, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Aaron. Pleasure to be
Great,
here.
great, thank you. Now, on this podcast, I discuss some of the areas that need to be improved in inner city communities. And one of these areas is incarceration. The incarceration rate in these communities is in the stratosphere. And as a consequence of that, a large number of people have criminal records. So that is why I found your article interesting, because you discussed approaches to employ people with criminal records as a means of reintroducing them back into society and hopefully preventing any reoffending. The article that I'd like to talk about is called Using Psychology to Improve Employment Prospects for the Formerly Incarcerated. So first, just so that my audience has some context, I want to read the opening paragraph of the article and get your thoughts. So you say here, quote, 95% of those who are currently incarcerated will one day be released. This means the vast majority of incarcerated individuals will re-enter society and attempt to rebuild a life. Study after study reveals the difficulties awaiting them, from acquiring employment and government benefits to obtaining housing and education, not to mention the general stigma that will follow them, unquote. So obviously this is a major problem, and that's what you're trying to look at, right? I mean, these issues, you're trying to look at how to reintroduce people back into their communities.
That's exactly right. And it really does touch so many Americans. There's an estimate that 1 in 3 Americans have some sort of criminal record. And of course, in some of the communities that your podcast really focuses on, those numbers are likely higher. And once an individual has a criminal record, even if it's just an arrest record or minor misdemeanor charge, that record can really follow them for the rest of their life. And it can make getting opportunities that many of us consider quite basic and necessary to living a fulfilling life very difficult. The main one that I focus on in my article is employment, because there's really good research that supports that if a person has good employment after they are released from jail, prison, essentially the system, they have a far greater chance of succeeding and not recidivating or reoffending. And this makes sense if you think about it from a common sense perspective. If you have a job and you have income coming in, you're able to support yourself and your family, that's probably going to decrease your likelihood of committing a lot of offenses that you might otherwise look to because of desperation or necessity.
And in the article, you actually mentioned two ways of improving this. One is reducing stigma, and the other is promoting hiring. Could you explain maybe what both of these mean?
Sure. Yeah. And this is just two buckets I sort of created to help understand the laws and policies that currently exist. And of course, there might be a policy that sort of falls into both buckets, and there's kind of a gray area. But roughly speaking, if we're promoting hiring of individuals with records, an example of that kind of policy might be a special sort of voucher or tax credit, for example, that an employer might receive if they do hire somebody from this vulnerable group. Reducing stigma, on the other hand, could be a cultural change of, hey, this criminal record isn't that big of a deal, and actually this is an individual who's going to be really hardworking. Or it could actually be reducing stigma by changing the nature of the criminal record, limiting the information, erasing the information, or providing more context to the information. Those are all possibilities. Yes.
Okay. Now, I think in your article, you actually focus on reducing stigma.
Yes.
So let's talk about that. But before we get into that, though, on how to reduce the stigma, is there any justification to have a stigma? I mean, I can picture someone saying, well, maybe there could be a liability when hiring people who have criminal records.
That's a really reasonable response, first of all. But when we look at the social science research, it's actually really promising that these individuals, even folks who do have criminal records, can receive second chances. It's logical to give them second chances. And so let me tell you a little bit about that research. one research study that I love citing to describes something called the point of redemption. And what this means is that at some point, an individual who's committed a crime and has a conviction, their chance of reoffending would be no different from someone without a record. And so to continually punish them after that point and hold this record and its stigma over them is counterproductive because their actual risk of reoffending is no greater than anyone in the general population. And this number would vary depending on the offense, probably between 3 to 7 years. That's what those researchers cite too. The other thing I'll say is that as human beings, and this is why I use the psychological approach in this policy study, as human beings, we're not really great sometimes at assessing risk and benefits. Sometimes we look at the risk of something and our minds outweigh that risk compared to the actuality of the risk happening. So people might look at a criminal justice record and they think it holds a much greater risk of liability than it actually does. And then finally, I'll say to the issue of liability, yes, there is a doctrine called negligent hiring liability, which means if you as an employer knew that you were taking on someone with a risk and then that person later reoffended in some way, you could be prone to a lawsuit, right? And I think that there are a lot of states that are exploring innovative approaches to address this issue, which is to say, if you are serious about trying to give these individuals second chances, there are states and localities that have actually taken on the liability themselves in saying, hey, employer, if you employ this person and they do something wrong, we will make sure that you are not sued for that. We want to give this person a chance. So I would say for the majority of people and that are getting released from jails and prisons, there isn't the liability we think that's associated with them is not actually as high as we think. And we really should be giving these people a second chance and a chance at the American dream.
I see. Now, you explore 4 strategies to reduce stigma that are meant to delay, limit, explain, or erase someone's criminal record. So I want to sort of maybe bunch these up into two groups.
Sure.
Let's take the first 2 first.
Okay.
So what's the rationale behind delaying or limiting one's criminal record to the employer?
Sure. The strategy of delay is a title I kind of give to general ban the box policies. The way ban the box works is that it just means that as an employer, you are going to get the information about your employees or prospective employees' criminal justice record, but you will have to wait. And whether that might be after the first interview, the second round, or even right before you actually make an offer. And the idea is that there used to be a box, right, on most job applications that says, have you been convicted of a crime? And you have to check the box. And what they found, researchers consistently found, is that this obviously, and you can imagine why, makes it much harder for those individuals to actually even get a first round interview. The idea with Ban the Box is to give you a chance to make a good first impression as a prospective employee and to withhold that information or delay that information just a little bit so that you have a chance to actually show that you can do the job and that you're a good person, make a good impression. And then once the employer gets that information, they might actually have already become kind of invested in hiring you, and it might help and cure some of the stigma. And there's some decent research. I will say it's a little bit mixed right now, and I'm hoping that we'll get better research as time passes on Ban the Box initiatives. Some of them are quite new. But overall, I'd say the research is somewhat positive that Ban the Box measures do help. But they might also create some other issues, which, like economist Jen Doliak has discussed, statistical discrimination is a term for this issue. And let me quickly explain what that is. Essentially, it means that if employers don't have this information about a criminal record, which they usually use to make decisions about hiring, they're going to look for a proxy. And unfortunately, the proxy that they've found that employers are using is race. So young Black men, young men of color, overall, even those who don't have criminal records are getting harmed potentially in places that are eliminating Ban the Box, because employers are just saying, well, if I don't have the criminal justice record information, I'm just going to, just blanket say that this whole group of people might have a record and I better protect myself. So that's one thing that comes up when folks talk about the strategy of Ban the Box and delaying criminal records. So limiting is another strategy that we see in the policy world. And when I say limit, I mean an employer might get an entire criminal record, but be told that they can only use a certain part of it. So they actually can see everything, but they're told, hey, you're not allowed to consider those arrests, or you're not allowed to consider those marijuana convictions. And I describe why psychologically this is really hard for people to do. And you can imagine why, right? So if you see something and then I immediately tell you, pretend you never saw that. If anything, it's just going to make you think about it more, right? And this is like called the pink elephant effect. And even if you really, really try to ignore it, it's still really hard for the human mind to do that. So I think of the 4 strategies, this is probably the least effective because we just can't unsee things. It's really hard as human beings. So it's going to color our judgment. And I do say if this is truly the law in some places, then at least have a third party like redact that information or something like that. So you are doing your due diligence and putting in a good faith effort as an employer and not, basically trying to ignore something that you just can't ignore.
Now, you also discuss strategies for explaining an expungement. So let's take the strategies to explain first.
Sure. I create this category called explain that generally means rather than limiting or giving employers less information, you're actually going to give them more information and provide the prospective employee a chance to explain what happened or provide additional information that shows that they've rehabilitated. So some states have programs like certificates of relief or certificates of rehabilitation, which don't erase or limit the conviction. It's still going to show up, but next to it on the disposition, it might mention that you did receive a certificate of relief. Typically, there's a waiting period before you would be eligible for one of these. And essentially, you would file an application to the state or the deciding body who's issuing these certificates, explaining how you had rehabilitated and you had made efforts after your release to make amends. And they would make a decision. And they, different states do this differently. Some have more sort of mandatory forms of relief, where as long as you fulfilled certain very clear conditions, you are entitled to it. Other states might say, well, it's really discretionary and we'll kind of just consider this whole body of what you've done since you've been out and see if you are deserving of this certificate. Pardon, almost always discretionary, right? So if you have, and it's very rare, I'll say in general, to receive a pardon. It's difficult sometimes it can be political, so hard to count on, but a pardon, I would say, is even more powerful. It's kind of essentially saying this didn't happen. This shouldn't be considered. This person's been pardoned. The comments for context is an interesting new feature that some job applications are essentially using, which is they give you a box to comment for context. So underneath the offense or even within your criminal record itself, there might be a space for you to explain what happened and what you've done since and why this really should be taken in a larger context of your life. So these strategies do seem like they may work. There is some good research. There's really not enough research, but the one study I think coming out of Ohio that I cite looks promising. And it seems that in that study, at least, if you have a certificate of rehabilitation, it increases your employability almost to as if you didn't have a criminal record at all, which is pretty great relief. Wow. Yeah. So again, this is, like I said, a great strategy in combination with maybe the others, especially for those offenses that a state doesn't want to provide expungement relief for, because it is a more serious offense, for example, or maybe you haven't met the waiting period for expungement, but you do meet a waiting period for certificates, right? So we can always strategize about how to combine these policies to give people the best relief possible.
Well, speaking of expungement, I want to read what you wrote in that article.
Sure.
And then I'll ask you a question after that.
Sure.
So you write, quote, "In light of all the limitations associated with strategies meant to delay, limit, and explain, the most powerful remedy is to address criminal record stigma at the source through expungement, as it has the unique ability not only to restore a person's ability to obtain employment, but can have positive effects in realms such as housing, education, and the exercise of civil liberties. This erasure school of thought functions under the notion that little to no information about a criminal past will lead to better job outcomes," unquote. So can you explain maybe what expungement means for those who may not be familiar with the term in this context?
Sure. Different states call it different things. It can be called expungement. It can also be called record clearing. Generally, what it means, and I'm probably over summarizing here because every state does this slightly differently, but it means that something is generally not going to show up on your criminal record after it's expunged if the criminal record is for most typical employers and scenarios. A lot of states create exemptions. So, law enforcement, prosecutors, in the event that you are prosecuted again for a new offense, high risk, sometimes vulnerable employers, like if you're working with childcare or the elderly, there might be exceptions. I will say that, but for the most part, when something is expunged, it's not supposed to show up on job applications or to your landlord or to a higher education institution if you're applying for college, for example. So it essentially is like it didn't happen.
Okay. And how does this integrate? 'Cause I can hear someone also asking or thinking how this integrates with the employer's rights. Do you think the employer has the right to know the criminal history of a prospective employee?
Sure. So this is where the state and the government has really, again, I think, made the right decision in terms of looking at the research and thinking about whether this information is the kind that is going to be really helpful and probative for an employer to know versus just extremely prejudicial and not helpful. And certainly there are offenses that we probably would never put in the expungement bucket because we think people always have a right to know. But what we found is that for a great majority of offenses, and again, after a certain waiting period has passed, like I explained with this point of redemption research, we're not getting useful information anymore. And so it almost is like going back to what I was saying about the limiting category, where if you are going to hear this information, you're not going to be able to unhear it. And it's going to make, it's going to color your decision to a point that doesn't make sense anymore almost. And it's never going to be able to give that person who's returning a true second chance, which we want to be able to provide if we're serious about reentry. If we really think that people deserve a chance to have a life after prison or jail, then I think we have to be serious about expungement. Yeah.
So I want to conclude this interview with another means of curbing the employment problem with those formerly incarcerated, which is preventing arrests and convictions in the first place.
Yeah.
So are there promising developments that you're aware of in preventing crime in teenagers in these high-risk communities?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a really, really great point, Aaron, because if we don't have people coming into the system in the first place, it's a lot easier than dealing with back end reforms like the ones we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes. So the main one that comes to mind is diversion. And what diversion means is that when an individual, usually fairly minor, sort of misdemeanor-ish conduct, gets into trouble, instead of booking and charging them, creating an arrest record and having them go through the system, you could even do what's called pre-arrest diversion. And this is where the decision is made to just keep this out of the judicial system altogether. And I think this relief is especially helpful when we're talking about young people, because we know young people do stupid things, right? So their frontal lobes are not fully formed until they're 25, 26, and they are risk-taking. They may be making mistakes that are illegal, but at the end of the day, what we found is that if we actually keep these young people out of the system altogether, their chances of reoffending are significantly lower. Just by booking and charging them and bringing them into court, you actually increase the risk that they're going to continue down this negative path. So I'm really thinking, for example, about the school to prison pipeline here. So a lot of school misbehavior, which maybe a couple decades ago would have just been handled in the school. Oftentimes, especially with school resource officers and the police getting more involved readily, these children are ending up in the system. And like I said, this is actually leading to some pretty negative outcomes. And some counties are, and I'm thinking of LA County here as an example, are exploring using diversion and using other methods when there is, this kind of misbehavior, risk-taking behavior, to provide the young person some resources and maybe some community mentoring. There's other options instead of getting them in the system, and have actually found some pretty dramatic and incredible positive results as a result of that. And pre-arrest diversion can also work with adults. There's no reason that it can't, and a lot of places are doing something like this, diverting them to different programs if they need that, services if it has to do with housing or mental health issues or drug treatment. There's lots of ways to address many of the criminal or minor criminal activities that we see without getting the system involved and having a much better result.
Well, that's a great hopeful note to end on. So before we go, though, Nila, where can people find you and your work online?
Sure. So you can go to the R Street website, and all my sort of articles, policy studies, op-eds are there. You can find me on Twitter. My handle is Nila Bala 3. Those would be probably the two main ways to find me and my work. And I hope you do if this is at all interesting to you.
Well, thank you so much, Nila, for taking the time to speak with me. It was very informative and I enjoyed it a lot.
Great. It was a pleasure to talk to you, Aaron.